We're so excited to be here. And I'm particularly excited to be here with my colleague, Lauren, my longtime colleague. She's been my partner in building the coaching services that we offer at Sounding Board. So I think this is the first time we've done a webinar together. So how fun. And
so long.
and you're seeing a picture now of some of the Sounding Board employees. And the reason I have that there, you go back one, oh yeah, okay, perfect. I see it now, is because I wanted to make a point about the evolution of the coaching industry. So having been an executive coach for 20 years, over that time frame, I provided probably about 5,000 coaching sessions over 20 years. But now that we have Sounding Board providing just a significant number more coaching sessions out there to leaders in enterprise companies, in mid-market companies, in just 5 years, Sounding Board has provided 50,000 coaching engagements and our coaching sessions. And that has given us a lot of information and data around, what's needed to develop leaders. I put a slide here of just some of our customers, just in case you think coaching isn't a thing. It really wasn't a thing when I started in the 90s. But it's definitely a thing now, and you can see some very large and medium-sized companies in here taking advantage of leadership coaching. And what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about what's important about leader development in the current environment, and then ways to think about developing your leader that goes well beyond probably what you've been doing for quite a few years, and eventually get to how coaching might be useful for folks in certain kinds of leadership development. So let's start with just looking at how the enterprise or corporate company environment has changed over the last 20 to 40 years. And it's fairly dramatic change. I'm sure you're all somewhat familiar with this. When I started my career, organizations spent 20 years developing a leader. They hired leaders right out of their education and kept them to retirement. And it was a lot of experience-based learning. You took on new projects, you took global assignments, you moved around in the organization to get the experience you needed to really move into the top positions. But over 20 years. And now the average tenure for a leader in an organization is 4.5 years. So clearly something's going to have to change there in how we do development. A lot of other changes too. Obviously, it was much more homogenous workforce back then. For the first 10 years of my coaching practice, I only coached men. And why was that? Because only men were in leadership roles in the companies that I worked in. Now, luckily, we're having a lot more diversity in our work population and also in our leader population, maybe not as much as we should, but more than we used to have. And so that's a big change as well. Obviously the current difference between everybody being in the office versus a whole lot of wide variety of ways people are working these days, difference in the number of generational cohorts in the workplace. There used to just be 1 or 2 generations. Now we have 5 generations in the workplace, and all of those generations really operate and think differently. And then, back then, only 3 women were CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies. Now we're up to 53. Still should be obviously much higher than that. But at least we're having a little bit of change there as well. So quite a dramatic change from last century to this century. And yet, a lot of the leader development approaches and programming and tools really are based in the last century. So our premise is like, hey, we need to start to get more current and update our approach, our thinking, our practices for the current environment.
Yeah. So we want to get your take on this too. We know you've also watched the revolution of our enterprise environment, and we want to get your take through a poll. So what else have you noticed has changed over the last 40 years in the workforce? We're going to launch a poll here. It's going to formulate a word cloud, but we're going to give you a chance to weigh in. Wow, love it.
Yeah.
Technology.
Yeah, I didn't even mention technology. It was kind of a given, but
right.
Should have said that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm appreciating this. Some of the comments are, I think, really especially more probably prevalent in the last 3 to 4 years through the pandemic. More flexibility around work hours, remote work, work-life balance, mental health awareness. This is a big focus and theme for a lot of HR professionals now. Yeah, a lot. Yeah, just recognizing the person in the workforce is kind of a theme across a lot of these. Flexibility, we're going to talk about that today. Politics, I feel like those have probably been held steady over the years. It's just what's political has changed.
Yeah, could be. Right. Yeah, and women leaders. Yeah, the big elephant in the room, technology.
Yeah, I know.
Should have that on the list.
We'll add that for next time. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. This is a good addition. We'll get a snapshot of these too. So Lori's going to take us next into why the change in the workforce matters when we're thinking about leader development.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sure you all have heard of this term VUCA. Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. The work world has changed from, say, the 70s and 80s, when it was much more predictable, homogenous, black and white, clear. And one thing that's really interesting is how that impacts planning and development. Because if the environment's very predictable, you can plan out pretty accurately over a long time. And yet, if the environment is not predictable, you're having to adapt. And as you all's name, be flexible pretty much in every moment. It's like very hard at this point to see around corners and see what's going to happen next. I wanted to show you this stats about how prevalent disruption is becoming since 1990. Can't even see that little number over there. Since 1990. So here's a couple of different slices of how to look at disruption. And, the basic image is everything's kind of going up and to the right. Just even the last one that's so dramatic with natural disasters per year. I'm sure you already have experience with how that is impacting business, the economic environment, and certainly workers in the workplace. So, yeah, it's not just anymore that we're talking about the VUCA environment. I've been talking about that all since the last century, but now all the stats are just really backing it up, and it can't be denied.
Yeah. So, of course, we know top of mind for you all is thinking about how do you prepare your workforce and the leaders of your workforce to navigate in this type of environment. What's really interesting is that Deloitte's 2023 Global Human Capital Trend Survey, Anna, you can switch to the next slide, showed that only 23%, about a quarter of respondents, felt that their organization's leadership actually had the capabilities that they needed to navigate in this type of world and environment. So many leaders are already finding it difficult to lead effectively in all different sorts of disruptions, exponential change. And yet almost half of the respondents reported that leaders are also feeling so overwhelmed by the number and frequency of disruptive shifts that are happening in the world and then in turn in the workforce. And so they're failing to prioritize accordingly. And we're just seeing that this level of uncertainty and disruption is kind of paralyzing leaders. They're feeling very ill-equipped with how to cope with the uncertainty. And so, of course, as our world is getting more complex and leaders don't have the capabilities they need to navigate that successfully, here comes your job, right? And why your job adds value to your organization. So let's take another little poll. This is the statistics from Deloitte Survey, but we want to know what percentage of employees in your organization do you believe currently have the capabilities that they need to manage and lead in this type of disruptive, uncertain world? So we're going to pull up the poll here, and you'll get some percentages to choose from. But what percentage of your employees do you believe currently have the capabilities needed?
Oh, wow.
So that's good. So far better than what Deloitte found on average, right? Or similar to about a quarter to up to 40%. Look, no one at 80 to 100%. Look how few 60% and above is, really 40% and above.
Oh my gosh, and the 0 to 20% group's pretty high too.
Yep, absolutely.
Oh, yikes.
Wow.
And growing.
Yeah, exactly. We don't need to tell you, you're experiencing this every day. So let's take a shift and kind of zoom in a little bit. We want to see what you believe this number is for yourself. So how would you rate your agreement with the statement, I believe I currently have the capabilities necessary to manage or lead in a disrupted, boundaryless world? What's your level of agreement with the following statement? Nice. Wow. Slightly agree. Okay.
Yeah, slightly agree. So, I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? You all are on the front lines, and you're going to need the skills pretty much before anybody else. And even just from the most basic of how to help other people gain the needed skills.
Yeah. So notice what it's like to just admit where you fall on here, given you're the ones responsible for helping develop employees to navigate in this world. Lori, where would you put yourself on this scale?
Oh, I put myself right in the big group of slightly agree. And the reason is, even though I've been around the block quite a few times in my career, I'm, pushing up to the 40th year of my career. I feel like things have changed so much that I'm having to continuously evolve to keep up with the changes.
Yeah. I was thinking about that too. I think it depends on my answer depends on the day and what I'm faced with and how confident I feel. But I think I'm mostly, I would say, in the slightly agree, because I've had to figure out, I think being a coach obviously helps with this, but figure out how to resource my confidence and trust in my experiences to think about what I'm facing. Not that I'm going to know what I'm going to face, but my trust in myself to be able to think through and wrap myself around really smart people who also know how to help me think about how we evolve in our work. Anna, let's move it forward. So, in the past, obviously, we're painting the picture here. Greater uncertainty makes flexibility even more valuable. And in the past, people, Lori and I were preparing for this conversation with you all today, and we thought about how in the past, people could have a structure and infrastructure or a strategic framework that could go 20 to 30 years into the future. And as Lori was mentioning that, I laughed out loud because I thought, there is no way. Like, think about today, we're facing situations like we've never seen before on a daily basis. Look at technology. That was the number one answer you all gave to the earlier question. Mm-hmm. We can't even predict today what's going to happen 3 to 6 months from now from technology that we're choosing to implement or adapt in the workforce. And that's just one aspect of our work. So you hear the words flexibility, you hear the words agility a lot when it comes to leader development. And this is really the why behind that need. I really like this next figure. What I think is super valuable about it is it shows that this was research that was done by McKinsey's Global Institute. It showed that individuals with proficiency in the self-leadership capabilities of adaptability and coping with uncertainty led to greater outcomes. So these top 2 capabilities, leaders that had these, they led to greater outcomes. This is what was really fascinating. Okay, first of all, these capabilities, they're not commonly covered in adult training programs. And these capabilities showed actually no association with formal higher education, which means it doesn't matter how educated you are. People aren't getting educated on how to be adaptable, and they're not getting educated on how to cope with uncertainty. So these capabilities don't come with formal education, and they don't typically come out of adult learning programs. So this is really kind of the why as to why a new approach in leadership development is needed, and why certainly adaptability and flexibility is really key for leaders. I don't want to pass over the second one on the list, which is coping with uncertainty. You know, as a coach, I think about this a lot because this is really leaders' ability to self-manage in their leadership. So not only how do they carry themselves in the face of uncertainty, but how do they carry their team in the face of uncertainty? One of the things we obviously found through the pandemic is that a lot of organizations were trying to get their leaders to, quickly deal with being in this new environment, get their teams quickly adjusted. And yet leaders themselves were in their own process of adapting and trying to cope with what was happening, literally while working at the kitchen table with their kids going to school in their house, and yet couldn't cope with it. And so, of course, how can they lead their teams through that? So this obviously moves us into, okay, so now what? You've made your point. We can't do the same thing in developing leaders and expect different results. So we're going to turn now to looking at how do we believe that we need to revolutionize leadership development to have greater impact. This next slide, I really think is an important part of the way we think about leader development at Sounding Board. One of the aspects I think of leadership development that isn't working is to think of what leaders need as just this idea of skills. So we actually believe that to build dynamic leaders, you need to develop, enhance, or expand these three things: skills, capabilities, and capacity. And I'm going to use some examples to bring these definitions to life. So when you think about a skill, this is really I'm going to take, for example, effective communication practices to navigate conflict. Do I as a leader know what models or approaches or literally what language I can use when communicating by email, when managing the conflict of two people on my team in a meeting? Do I know how to approach that in that moment? That's really the skill level. Capability level is, can I recognize the moment I'm in right now as the moment in which I need to draw upon that skill set? And do I have the mindset that's going to help support me in effectively implementing those skills that I have? So am I dreading the conflict, or am I seeing it as a moment to help shift the way my team is working and deepen our working relationships? That's really where the mindset comes in. And then for us, capacity is kind of that next level, which is, can I expand my range of abilities to help others navigate conflict beyond my team? So can I do this not only for myself, but can I do it with a peer? Can I lead up and help my manager navigate through conflict effectively? Can I help other senior leaders in the organizations navigate conflict? And can I even help navigate conflict with external stakeholders or partners that we're a part of? So you can see these are really levels of evolved skill and capability, looking a little bit further out and more strategic kind of within that leadership development frame. Anything you want to add here, Lori?
Yeah, I wanted to just add that as you go from skills to capabilities to capacity, it becomes both more complex and more intangible. So a basic model for conflict management can be taught in a skill structured way. Now you add the complexity of in a team meeting, or with multiple personalities, or with diversity, or with business and economic issues. And now you're talking about in the capacity, how do I do this with the internal sense of calmness and power and strength that lets me apply my skills and capabilities in very challenging, maybe never faced before circumstances. So it's kind of
uncertainty again.
Yeah, the uncertainty, there's been a lot of focus on skills, upskilling and skill development platforms, and nothing wrong with skills. We have them as a key component. We just think skills are not enough in the current environment.
Yeah, great bottom line. So let's see where your programming is focused today. Where in your organization are you putting most of your programming or leader development dollars? Are they going towards building skills? Are they going towards building capabilities? Are they going towards building capacity? We'll turn to the poll and see what you all think. Not a surprise, right? Building capacity, I think, is a really newer way of thinking about this. I do like seeing that there's some balance between skills and capabilities, that we have begun to level up our approach. That's great. And I think that also speaks to, Lori shared how many different organizations we're working with, and of course, have adopted coaching as an example of a space in which building capabilities probably makes it easier to implement than just revolutionizing, your standard leadership development training programs.
Yeah, actually, in designing Sounding Board, we set up our coaching process to be building capabilities, because we felt like there really already is a lot of opportunity for building skills, but not as much opportunity for building capabilities. And we found about half of our customer companies have capability or competency type models built out around leadership, and about half do not. They really rely on the skill building aspects, and then just, sort of like a leadership it factor, right? Like, hey, we give you the skill, kind of like up to you if you can, be the star on the stage with them. We actually think it's more important than that, and that individuals need support and help and guidance in developing both capabilities and capacity that work well in their given environment.
Yeah, so we're going to transition. Lori's going to talk through kind of a mental framework, mental and actual framework you could adopt and use to think about how to organize your leadership development programs for the future.
So we're going to start to talk about horizontal development versus vertical development. We're starting with this slide of someone just walking down, basically a flat road. It's still curving at the end because it's pretty hard to see what's coming after the curve right now. But notice at least the, recent future is going to be visible to folks. And horizontal development is basically lateral development. In other words, it's not helping you advance to the next level. It's helping you be successful and competent at the current level where you are. And here's a definition for you, but this tends to be more in the skill building arena. It's how to get better at your current challenges, at things that are a little bit more clear and predictable, and that you can see in front of you. So it's almost like leveling up where you're standing. And
one thing I would add, one thing here, which is I think most people managers, this is more of their comfort zone, is supporting employees in horizontal development, because they've likely been in that role or been in a similar role before. And so like, I know how to teach somebody if I've done that work. But I think they also, it's kind of what's expected out of me, right? And as you get into talk about vertical development, I think not only is that a challenge or a stretch for leaders, but it's also a stretch for people managers to be able to develop others in the vertical space.
And one reason is it just gets more complex. Like, you might be able to help your employee develop a single skill, but if you're going to help them develop capabilities that is a blend of multiple skills, that's a lot more challenging. And then you're going to try to help them develop a capacity to use those skills in a much broader set of circumstances. Boy, you're starting to get over the head. And also just the time frame for most people managers don't have the bandwidth to do that. So let's take a look at the vertical development as well. And I just like the pictures to give you the point. The vertical development is well beyond basic skill building. You are actually going to places as a leader that you haven't gone before, that you haven't thought about, that you haven't faced. It requires you to kind of dig deep to get up to this, peak on a mountain here. It's not an easy path. It's not just a flat path where you can walk your own pace. You're going to have to actually work to climb this hill. Mm-hmm. And here's a little definition of vertical development, but you can see it's much more context driven, situationally driven. It requires a sophistication around thinking. It's not really an if A, then B kind of thing. If A, then apply this skill. It really is, if A, here's, B to Z available for you to figure out what you want to use. And so it also requires kind of an internal interior development for leaders so that they have the resources both to know all the options that are available, make good choices about all those options, and then to be able to self-manage in a way that lets them do that with clarity, non-bias, agility, that kind of thing. So it's really a pretty tall order, this vertical development. I wanted to just take it down to very practicals in case you're, thinking really, I'm not sure if I get this difference between vertical and horizontal. So here you go. The horizontal development, it really helps the individual get things done in their current job. While the vertical development helps them create situationally effective, sustainable impact as a leader. So it's not a point in time, it's really impact over time. And that impact is happening regardless of the changing circumstances.
I think the term situationally effective is really important to hone in on. We keep talking. I think we should have a bingo card for how many times we say complex, uncertain environment. But that is true, right? So what you leverage in this moment with this person, or to influence an outcome, is different from what you might leverage in another moment, depending on the circumstances. So I feel like that's a really critical piece of this.
Yeah. And here's a couple of kind of environments where you might apply each horizontal and vertical development. So notice the ones on the top are more job skills or development in a function and expertise, where the vertical development is more situational and how to respond to these larger situations that are going on. One of the ones, obviously the global pandemic, one of the ones that's going on right now is the current macroeconomic situation. It's in a way nobody's ever seen before. People are just surprised about hey, this one thing is happening and then something entirely different is happening. Are we having a recession? We're not having a recession. How long is this going to last? How do we impact it? How do we change it? How do we, where even do we want it to go to? All of that is all in the vertical development range. And you might notice something really interesting. The economic environment gives a little picture of how we think about horizontal and vertical development. We have very seasoned older people weighing in on the economy who have seen things over 40, 50, 60 years. But in a work environment, you can't always have that level of experience available to deal with the situations that come up. So really the question is, yes, if everybody's over 60 and been doing this for 40 years, maybe they have an idea of how to respond, but what about everybody else? That age group's going to be retiring soon, and we have to figure out how to help leaders have the same level of impact and success as people who have been doing this for 40 years when our leaders have been doing it for 5 years. Yeah, Lauren, did you want to say something about that? You're shaking your head there.
Well, no, I think it's about, how do you think about your work? It's one thing to have had the experience, but what we're describing is the experiences we're facing today aren't necessarily experiences that even folks who've been in the workforce for 40 years have seen before. So to me, it doesn't really matter. Almost experience can be void in certain circumstances today. It's, do you know how to think about what you're seeing? And then once you've thought about it, do you know how to act in a way that you think can create the type of results that your organization is trying to have?
So we're going to go to another little poll here.
Yeah. So we want to see, where is most of your programming or development focused or targeted today? Is it mostly at the horizontal development level? Is it at the vertical development level? Is it a little bit of both, or a mixture of both? Good.
Okay, that kind of matches pretty well with some of the earlier polls we saw. So a lot of focus on horizontal development, less on vertical. But I'm loving the percentage of folks that are focusing on both. Oh, wow. And it's basically even, more or less even now.
It's a horse race.
Yes, you all are right on target, because this is actually where we're going to go next, is basically how does horizontal development and vertical development work together to create the kind of leader development programs and leaders that you're looking for. So we think of them as complementary. One more transactional, and not in a bad way transactional, and one more transformational. So transactional because it's actually easier to measure. You can tell, does someone have this skill or they don't have this skill? They completed a training, they didn't complete a training. Yes, I did it. No, I didn't. And it's more outcome focused because there's just a more tangible focus to the horizontal development. The vertical development, we think of it as more transformational because it's actually not just external change, but internal change as well. And so you're really going to have to change your mindsets and thinking to be able to develop in this way.
It's multidimensional too, right? So you were describing, for me, interacting in an organization, there's an internal thinking process, assessment of my own behaviors. Then if I'm interacting with Lori in a conversation, I have to be able to read what's happening over there for her. And then that's all surrounded by the fact that we're also in an organizational context, in a world context. Whereas what Lori was describing with transactional, it's very binary in many ways.
100%. And the other thing about the vertical, it's not just outcome oriented, it actually is impact oriented as well. So again, it's harder to measure. You know, most organizations have a way to measure outcome. You have goals and you're measuring against these goals, but impact, how do you measure that? How do you measure, you know, well around how people feel about your leadership? How do you measure the number of, you know, better decisions versus worse decisions? You know, it gets hard to measure the outcome at this level. And we're also, in addition to outcome, looking at impact, short-term and long-term impact. The thing I really like about having horizontal and vertical development work together is it creates continuous, ongoing growth. And I think of it like this triangle where if you're constantly expanding your foundation, the base of your triangle, that allows your vertical development to continue to expand as well. If the base is solid, stationary, now your development's going to hit a peak. And that peak may or may not be at the level that the organization is now needing from their developments. From their leaders. At Sounding Board, we operate it through a set of values. And one of our values is continually evolve. And the reason we have that as a company and a value is we see that this changing environment requires continuous learning, even for the leaders at the top of the organization. Like, nobody can stop learning at this point and still be successful.
Yeah, I think the other great thing about this image is the horizontal development creates the foundation and the base upon which vertical development happens. So the wider your base, the more stable and steady that infrastructure is, right? Or that human being is. So as they continue to expand the models and exposure and frameworks that they have that help them be successful and expand their skill range, then they have a wider base of skills to draw upon when they're in more complex situations to leverage.
100%. So we want to, you got this idea now of horizontal and vertical development and how they work together. We noticed on your polls, there hasn't been much focus on vertical development. So we want to share almost like the beginnings of a model that Sounding Board is creating to start to identify some of these more intangible components that go into vertical leader development. And I kind of think it's like the X Factor or whatever that singing show was, something like that, because it's like, hey, here, this person's a good leader, but this person over here is an exceptional leader. What makes the difference between those two kinds of leaders? So we try to identify some core areas and then some sub capacities that go to support those 4 areas. So flexibility, we talked about a little bit. Flexibility is actually very broad. It includes lots of different things. One of which I'm going to name is just flexibility in your thinking. Mm-hmm. If you're kind of inflexible there and you're doing what used to work, you're likely not going to be that successful now. So you need that mental, intellectual, almost ego flexibility that allows you as a leader to be okay with not knowing the answer and looking for new ways of operating. I'm sure you all understand that self-regulation is pretty important for this level of a leader, but how do you teach that? It's very hard to teach self-management from a skill perspective. It's something that's kind of like an inside game, an inside job. And so how do you help people develop that from the outside? We found out pattern recognition is really critical to this exceptional leadership. Coaches generally are pretty good at this because you just get trained over time to notice the patterns of someone's language or circumstances or thinking or mindsets. But leaders need this as well, and they need to be able to identify the patterns and then also understand, which patterns are continuing, which ones are old, which new patterns need to be implemented. So it's not just the recognition of the pattern, but how to utilize that recognition in the specific circumstances they're facing. And then the last one there on the outside circle, velocity. We've used this term not from a speed perspective per se, but from a perspective of what moves the business, the organizational, the work faster the most. So things like courage, focus, agility, and tenaciousness. People mention technology, and I actually think it's been harder and harder and harder for people to focus. There's such just an onslaught of information. Yeah. And how do you sort all of that and just really stay on the heart of the matter that you're working with? And then, of course, it's courage, the willingness to actually take that desired action or pathway, even in the face of, dislike, distrust, possible disasters down the road. That, in the current environment, courage is actually kind of a critical capability to develop. And then I'm just going to talk last about the internal compass idea. Hey, with so much swirling around people on the outside, a key capacity is how do you keep your internal composure? Many people call that an internal compass because it can have moral questions related to it. I like to call it the central equilibrium, which is there's a way internally you're keeping your equilibrium, you're staying balanced. But I usually describe this by talking about the eye of the storm. So even if you have a big hurricane that's blowing a lot of knots and knocking things down and impacting people, at the eye of that storm is a little circular space where it's calm and the wind is not blowing in there, and it's actually sunny in that one little circle inside the storm. So the question is, how do you help leaders stand in the center of the storm and not get sucked over into the big swirl that's going around them? Yeah, you can go to the next one. So that brings us to why coaching. We feel like, as you've all indicated, there's a lot of programs to help with horizontal development. There's less programs to help with vertical development, and that coaching is a key tool around vertical development because it is personalized. It's customized to that individual leader. It's situational. It's in real time. It's the real work-life situations that the leader is working through with their coach. And that coaching one-on-one is kind of the traditional executive approach, but there's lots of other models for getting that same kind of personalized development that's not one-on-one. So mentoring can offer that as well. Sponsorships, variations on group coaching, peer coaching, even on-demand coaching where a employee could bring a specific situation to a coach, where the coach provides the sounding board and helps them think through all of the options, what kind of thinking is needed to address the situation, and then come up with a plan of action. And to have this kind of vertical development operating company-wide, you're going to need technology to manage it. No longer can be done on a piece of paper. So Sounding Board, as well as others, can help you with the technology to be able to both deliver, manage, and measure these kinds of more individualized programming. Lauren, anything you want to say about coaching in your last minute here?
Yeah, I was thinking about in this moment, I was like, I really don't think you can accomplish vertical development without in real time development. which is why coaching has been so attractive to people, or in any of these other human-centered development approaches. But there's something about I find myself in a situation I haven't been in before, and to be intentional and conscious about how I lead into and through that situation, I need to process that. And one of the things, of course, that we hope out of coaching is we're developing, the internal capabilities, reflection practices for leaders to be able to do that independently. And you don't start there. You have to build that practice. And part of building that practice comes with working with somebody else, whether it's a coach or a mentor or a sponsor, who can help you to develop those reflective practices in your own leadership. Going back to, it's not only about outcome, but it's about impact, to help you reflect on your impact, both at an individual and interpersonal level, but also certainly at an organizational level, and results impacts as well.
Right. Well, thanks, Lauren. This is our basic content we wanted to deliver, but we wanted to open the floor to you all for your questions and comments. And I think Tanya is going to help us do that.
Yes, very much. Thank you so much, Lori and Lauren. What a very enlightening and such a timely conversation. So yeah, we do want to open it up to questions. We just want to remind you that if you were last in there as a poll, that same widget, turn it back on as your Q&A widget to the right of the webcast video player. Just click on the top there. And we do have some questions already in. So let's start with this first one. Is adaptability even teachable, or is it a dimension of personality that needs to be assessed and identified?
Fantastic question. I mean, I think we've all met people that make us wonder if it is teachable. But interestingly, there actually are components of adaptability that are teachable. Not skills though, right? Because adaptability is a way of thinking. It's a way of being and operating in the world. So it can't be taught on a doing level, but it can be taught, and I would say it a little bit differently, cultivated on a being level.
Yeah. And I would add that people have to want to be adaptable, to want to fan the flame that might be internal, to be able to say, oh, how do I do more of that? And sometimes adaptability, I think, is impacted by a strong steadfastness around a certain set of values, personal values. So for example, if I really value continuity or stability, that value, if I hold on to it too tight, might get in the way of my ability to be adaptable. Doesn't mean I'm incapable of it, but I'm at choice around where I see value and where I want to leverage that within the, again, situations you encounter as a leader.
And I would say one last thing about that is, adaptability requires courage. And so courage is also something that can be developed over time by taking apart what are the fears that are stopping people from adapting to any given situation.
Yeah, I love that.
Terrific. Yeah, I love that too. Just being values based and moving from doing to being. That's so powerful. That's great. Another question here. When you say these traits are linked with better outcomes, can you define those outcomes? What are the outcomes that are related to these traits of vertical development?
Well, I think my thought here is this goes back to what Lori was talking about around horizontal versus vertical development. When you think about impact, so when you're focused around leveraging leadership capabilities and expanding your capacity, what you're really doing is trying to maximize the impact you can have as a leader. So the outcome becomes, am I more effective in interpersonal relationships? Can I now be more effective in how I lead a group of people around how they're functioning and help a team, for example, to be higher performing? Because I'm helping them see where they are and are not able to have the impact that they want. All of that, of course, then can lead to organizational results and outcomes, because I'm assessing, what do I need to do differently to lead a group of people towards a set of outcomes? That all comes down to impact. It's as simple as, how am I thinking about things? How am I acting in certain moments? But it's kind of like a snowball effect when you roll that up over time, that ultimately leads to, can we have the impact we're trying to have? And how do we need to be thinking and behaving to align towards the potential for that impact to be achieved?
Yeah, so the definitely impact measurements. And I also think another piece that we look at is acceleration. So accelerated development of leaders. How do you get leaders operating at a level you need in 4 years versus 20 years? Accelerated decision making. The more successful leaders are in capacity building, the faster they're able to make a better decision. So when you see organizations that start lagging behind kind of the curve of things, nowadays, when that happens, it's very impactful for the organization. And a lot of that has to do with not seeing the pattern of what's coming down the pike and not being able to replicate or come up with a decision that impacts that pattern. So I'll give you a very specific example. There were a number of companies that had a big boost during the pandemic. And yet most of those companies just made an assumption that that boost would continue post-pandemic. And now are being very shocked this year and the end of last year when their subscription or usage or products are not selling in the same way that they were in the pandemic. Yeah. So it takes an intangible development approach that then creates very tangible outcomes.
Yes. Yeah. What important outcomes in a VUCA world that we're living in.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I think we have time for one more question. Let's see, can vertical development be taught in a formal class, or is it more experience-based? And you talked about the human-centered development, the mentorships and the coaching and sponsorships. So the question is it more experience-based learning, as the examples that you gave? And then there's a second question here. How do you scale this to a larger audience?
Oh, our favorite question. This one there. So experience-based, yes, as well as reflective. So Lauren was talking about, how to help people learn a reflective model that lets them kind of look on the inside as well as the outside. A teach model doesn't really work well with vertical development because it's not taking into account the individual, how mindsets are changed, the specific circumstances. And I used to do training and development, and I was struck even way back then how the questions from the participants would always be about application. Like they got the concept, they got the skill, and then they'd be like, what about this situation? But what about this person? But what about my manager? What about in this negotiation? It was all very specific to their world. So I think small groups like a peer group learning, a group coaching, skill application through a group model works much better for this because it lets the individual both figure out how to apply it to them specifically and then specifically to the areas of concern that they have.
Yeah, I would add too, like simulations are a great way to bring vertical development to life. They're often very costly to facilitate, to make them feel real life and applicable. So I think what you're coming down to is the cost of creating powerful vertical learning in a formal classroom environment versus the cost of, and this goes to the scalability, the cost of bringing this type of development into the day-to-day of leadership. And I think the other thing I think it's important to factor in is, leaders have made it very clear, don't send me to 4 or 5 day trainings and then not give me any support to ground that back in the day-to-day. They'd much rather have the in real time development on their job so they can take, and it also creates micro bursts moments of, okay, here's my focus for this week. Here's my focus for this month. And so they can have kind of a laser focus and stage up that leveling up and development, over time. Laura, you want to talk about the scaling?
And how to do that? We're choosing to do it virtually. It can be done also in person, but virtual allows more people to access this kind of development. And then with technology, so software that helps you deliver this kind of development, manage it, measure it, even train people in how to offer this kind of development. So that's really what Sounding Board is all about. So just last plug, if you want to know more about that, definitely check out our website. And if you want to know more about this concept of vertical and horizontal development, I have a book coming out in October, and you can go ahead and order it off of Amazon or from our website as well. And thank you very much for listening to us. You can tell we like to talk about these topics. We think it's the future of development.
Absolutely. That hour went by so fast. Thank you so much to Lori and Lauren. And just a reminder for HCI members, today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit, as well as for HCI recertification. Your credits for attending this webcast will soon show up in your My HCI portal under the transcript tab. While you're there, don't forget to check out hci.org, even more insights as well as information on our certifications, virtual conferences, premium membership, and more. One more time, I'd just like to thank Lori and Lauren, our presenters today, and the good people at Sounding Board. And also thank you, our webcast viewer. Thanks for spending this hour with us, and we'll see you real soon.